Well, the Liberal carbon tax, we now know, is so ineffective, it would have to rise by 400%, or double what the Liberals have publicly projected, in order to do what it promises.
The plan is not to increase the price post-2022. We are doing exactly what we said we do, what we negotiated with provinces and territories in 2016.
I think we're going to take a step back and first acknowledge that a price on pollution is incredibly important. But it's not enough to just put a price on pollution. So our plan is we've got to go beyond that.
We need to do twice as much as is currently being proposed. And you can't do twice as much and only use carbon pricing as the mechanism.
Canada's budget watchdog has crunched the numbers on the federal government's carbon tax, and he says the current plan would fail to meet the Paris Agreement targets. Right now, the price on carbon is $20 per tonne of emissions, and that's set to rise to $50 by 2022. The PBO estimates that price would reduce emissions to 592 megatons of CO2 by 2030, but the Paris target is 513 megatons. According to the PBO, Canada needs to increase the carbon tax by an extra $6 per tonne in 2023 and eventually by $52 extra in 2030, which would put the overall price on carbon in 2030 at $102. That said, the report doesn't factor in some government investments and promise investments made into public transit and clean technology. So could the targets be reached without raising the carbon tax? Yves Giroux is the Parliamentary Budget Officer. He joins me now in studio. Hi, Mr. Giroux. Nice to see you again.
Likewise.
So you decided to conduct this study on your own. No MP asked you to do it. What prompted you to ask this question and study it?
Well, we noticed that there's a plan for the government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that goes into 2022. The targets to get to the Paris Agreement targets the date is 2030. So in between, doesn't seem to be a particular change of tactic or approach. So, and the government has in itself stated that there will probably 79 megatons of CO2 emissions that still need to be reduced. So we decided to look at what would be necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 79 megatons. What kind of carbon pricing would be necessary to be in place in addition to what's already scheduled to be in place? So what's the increase between 2023 to 2030 that would be necessary to get us to meeting Paris targets?
And what you found basically was that eventually by 2030, it'll have to be about $102 a ton.
Exactly. So for provinces that are in the federal backstop system, there's already scheduled to be an increase from $20 a ton to $50 between now and 2022. So in addition to that $50 in 2022, you need to increase it by an additional $6 in 2023, rising to an additional $52 for a total of $102 per ton.
As you know, there is a huge political debate around the price that's put on carbon, the tax, whatever you want to call it. What does that mean for you and I, for people at home watching? What does $102 a ton mean for them?
Well, for that price for carbon emissions, we know that a liter of gasoline emits, when it's burned, 2.21 kilograms of CO2. So if you do the math, it's 23 cents per liter of gasoline. So that's one way of looking at it. Depending on where you live, electricity generation can be through non-CO2 emitting sources, or it can be through coal burning or fossil fuels, other fossil fuels. So in that case, electricity prices would also have to go up, or there would need to be a substitution, like the power generation would need to come from other sources.
So oftentimes when we're asking the government, will it go up, and if so, by how much, they point to the fact that it is just one part of their entire plan to combat climate change or to combat carbon emissions. Is that the case still? I mean, are you assuming that all these other things exist when you're still talking about the increase?
We're assuming that after 2022, the only thing, if we were to do only carbon pricing, that's how much it would cost. But if the government chooses to do something else, for example, regulations or subsidies to certain sectors to reduce their emissions, there would be still a price for these regulations or subsidies. But carbon price would not need to go up by as much. So for example, if the government was to decide to plant millions and millions of trees to reduce the net emissions, planting these trees costs something. It means that you spend on planting trees, for example, you don't have to increase the price of carbon by as much. But there's a variety of measures that could be taken.
Are there risks to the other side that would necessitate an even bigger increase in the carbon price?
It's quite possible. So, for example, if there's strong economic growth in Canada and low oil prices, other things being equal, the price of oil or gas being cheap, people will drive more, will buy bigger cars. If the economy is booming, people will have more money to spend on, you guess it, gasoline, trips, airlines, and so on. So if there's a booming economy, it means that we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by an even more, a bigger amount. On the opposite, if the economy tanks, economy slows down, then greenhouse gas emissions will not grow as fast, so the price on carbon will probably not need to go as high. And if there's a big technological breakthrough, somebody finds a magical way to generate power without emitting any carbon, and that's dirt cheap, then it'll be fairly easy to meet our Paris target. But in the absence of that,
Right.
That's the price of carbon.
We did, our colleague, actually, Julie Van Dusen, did catch up with Environment Minister Catherine McKenna today, asked about your report. I want to play the clip of what she had to say and then get your response. Let's listen.
The Parliamentary Budget Office report has nothing to do with our climate plan. Our climate plan includes a price on pollution. We give the money back to families. 80% of families are better off, especially middle and low income families. And we have a whole range of other measures. It doesn't represent the approach that we have taken, which is to make sure that life is affordable, that we're growing the economy, and that we're tackling climate change.
So she says your report has nothing to do with their climate plan. What do you say to that?
Well, we looked at all the measures that were in place or announced as of September 2018, because at one point we had to draw a line in the sand and stop looking at all the changes in the Canadian landscape. But we took into consideration all the measures that the government has announced. There are some measures that are hard to quantify. For example, investments in public transit. This will probably reduce greenhouse gas emissions if people drop their cars, stop using their cars, and start using public transit. Same with some measures that include investments in strategic investment fund. These could lead to technological advances that will indeed reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but there's no firm quantification of these impacts. So that's why we have not considered all of them, but even that costs something. So investing in strategic investments funds, investing in public transit, it does reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it does cost something. So the purpose of the report is not to say carbon pricing is the only way to go, but carbon pricing, if that's the only thing you do, that's by how much you have to price carbon.
And actually on the flip side, because that's, the government is saying that conservatives, we don't know their plan yet, we'll find out next week, but we know that it won't involve a carbon price. You also sort of mentioned in the report that all those other measures, whatever you do decide to do, whether it be through regulation or other means, that also comes at a cost too.
Of course. So if you decide to regulate, for example, if you regulate that no car will be consuming more than 7 liters per 100 kilometers, then it has a cost. It has an implicit cost in that you can't use certain types of vehicles. If you regulate that power generators cannot use fossil fuels, well, they'll have to use alternative sources. So there is a cost to regulation. There is a cost, obviously, to subsidies. The difference between carbon tax or carbon pricing and regulations and subsidies is that a price on carbon is quite obvious and transparent, whereas regulations, it imposes a cost on certain sectors of the economy, and it's not as transparent for the rest of the population.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Giroux. Appreciate your time today. That's Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux.
And we clearly need Alberta to be part of our national climate plan, as Alberta has the highest emissions in the country. I notified him that the price on pollution will apply as of January 1st next year, that by law, 90% of the revenues must go back, 100% of the revenues go back to Alberta, 90% of the revenues go back to Albertan families.
The fact is we're going to remain having the lowest gas prices in the entire country, at least until January 1st. This opens up several opportunities over the coming months to be able to have a conversation about the way that we intend to handle climate change. And, of course, there'll be a federal election in between, and many things can happen between now and January 1st.
Environment Minister Catherine McKenna says the feds will impose a carbon tax on Alberta as of January 1st, 2020. She made the announcement, as you saw there, before question period. It comes on the same day the Parliamentary Budget Officer put out a report on the carbon tax, specifically how high and broad the carbon tax would have to be to hit the Paris targets on emissions. The PBO pegs it at eventually $50 a tonne more than the current plan. So how does this change the debate around the carbon tax, or does it? And what is Alberta's next move as it's added to the other 4 provinces currently under the federal carbon price? Time for the Power Panel. In Toronto, Melissa Lantzman of Hill & Knowlton Strategies. She's next to former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson, Chief of Government Relations for the University of Toronto. And also in Toronto, iPolitics' Marika Walsh. David Ertel, former Quebec Liberal Minister of both Immigration and Environment, joins us from Montreal. Hi, everybody. Great to see you. Hey. David, I'll start with you. What do you think? I'll start with the PBO report. What do you think it does to the discussion? I say generously, the debate, I guess the fight about the carbon tax?
Well, if you really want to put a real price on carbon, I went through the same thing, and our government went through the same thing with the cap and trade system. The real price would have to be over $100 a tonne, actually. But what mitigates that price, what lowers it, is subsidies, regulation, grants, and a whole set of different policies that makes it possible to have a much lower price. So what the PBO says is right, but it has to be seen in the broader context of the overall policies. What's interesting here is the timing of Catherine McKenna's announcement. I don't think it's a fluke. Actually, to announce this on versus Alberta on the same day that the PBO report comes out actually changes the story a bit. And now you have both sides on this debate talking to their constituencies and saying, see, on the Liberal side that wants to get the environmental constituency across Canada saying, look, we're tough on this, we're going after Alberta. And of course, on the other side, see, again, Justin Trudeau's Liberals are coming after us.
Melissa, do you think the timing was also no coincidence?
Well, I don't think I share the view on the timing of announcement. I actually think it's very poorly timed because it brings back the conversation about taxes. And, for a long time, we heard the Liberals say that this is going to be $20, and we're seeing that, a price that is 5 times that, which eventually puts you at about a quarter a litre more of gas at a time where they're going into a federal election. I've sat here on this panel before, and it's well known that this isn't a conversation about the environment. It's a conversation about levying taxes on a population and making life more expensive right across the country, and today Alberta included. So I don't think we won't see them go to court, and I don't think, frankly, that they were elected without a mandate to do so. I think it was very clear in Alberta that the people of Alberta elected Jason Kenney on the premise that he would work to fight the carbon tax.
To David's point, though, Andrew, this was the study was done looking at it almost in exclusion of other things. Although the PBO said, for example, it's hard to estimate the degree to which investments in public transit will help, will mitigate how high the price has to be. Like it all seems very difficult to calculate and to know for sure if what the government is pursuing will actually get to the Paris targets. Although what we do know now is that it isn't.
Well, they're not likely to get to the Paris targets anytime too soon, and frankly, even at $100 a tonne, I think they're going to have a hard time doing that in isolation because it's not the behavior change. I mean, if we look today, the price of gasoline, at least here in downtown Toronto, is 10 cents a litre less than when the carbon tax went on. What did the carbon tax do to change behavior? Nothing. Gasoline is cheaper today than it was on April 1st. So I don't quite get why they think that this is the right solution. The better solution is to look seriously at pricing carbon in a way that encourages cap and trade, starts to change the behavior of the major emitters, and allows for other options to be brought to the marketplace, including better transit. But that's not going to happen by just putting more of a price on gasoline. And this is what I think is really missing in this debate. The good news is that other parties, and the NDP's Green Platform that came out a few weeks ago, actually does have a lot of other measures in it which go well beyond the idea of just pricing carbon and start looking at how do you actually start to move to a low carbon economy. And that's the debate that needs to happen. It's definitely not as exciting as the lightning rod around carbon taxes, but it is actually going to get the job done.
Okay, I do have to add a little bit to the excitement because our show tweeted out what Catherine McKenna said about imposing the tax and what we played off the top of this segment. And Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, just retweeted that tweet, so what Catherine McKenna had said, and says, "We will stand up to this federal effort to punish Albertans for heating their homes and driving to work. Our government will launch an immediate constitutional challenge of this federal tax grab through a judicial reference to the Alberta Court of Appeal." So that's just out from Premier Jason Kenney. His response to the federal government saying that they will impose their carbon tax on the province of Alberta, which isn't a surprise. They just basically named a date today. They're waiting until January 2020. Marika?
Yeah, it all shows that they're just going more deeper into their own trenches, right? There's more antagonism happening between the two sides. We saw that with the actions on Bill C-69, and now we're seeing it again with the federal government deciding that today is the day to tell Alberta that carbon tax is coming. And I talked to McKenna's office, and they said there was no sort of legislative timeline or mandatory timeline that they had to give all this breathing room to Alberta businesses and the economy out there and industry out there to give them this warning. So they decided it was a political decision to release this letter today, and I think that's what's key here. We see now the strategy that's coming, and it will become more clear, I think, once we see Andrew Scheer's environment plan and climate change plan next week.
Yeah, that's coming, I think, next Wednesday, something like that. Anyway, midweek. David, you were nodding your head when Marika was saying this sort of further entrenches everyone's position.
Well, yeah, because I think right now this is where both sides want to draw one of the ballot questions. They're trying to position the ballot questions for October. And on this one, again, the Liberals, I've seen it like just in Quebec yesterday. You had a press conference by Stephen Guilbeault, who is in Quebec, sort of has the same notoriety as David Suzuki has across Canada. And there's a huge rumor, and it's almost confirmed, that he's going to run for the Liberals in Quebec. And so they're really going after that constituency and trying to nail down that progressive environmental constituency. So I think they really want to have an answer to Trans Mountain and other issues like that have weakened their environmental position. But one argument, to go to Andrew's point, I think one other argument that's missing, obviously I'm for cap and trade, I'm biased, I set up the cap and trade system to link with California, but other than that, the Liberals aren't making the argument about the cost of doing nothing against climate change. The costs like flooding, fires, and this huge cost to inference.
You don't think they're making that argument?
I'm not hearing it. I'm only hearing the pricing pollution, and that's always pricing pollution equates more taxes. And yes, the extra tax argument is not an easy one to make. But on the other side, what you could hear is what it cost us as Canadians to pay for all these impacts that we're seeing year after year.
Melissa, what do you think?
Well, I think people are motivated sort of by self-interest, and costs in the future often don't mean anything. We see that all the time.
Future, though, we're seeing those effects all the time right now.
Take in Quebec, the last 3 years we had floods for 2.
Yeah,
you're actually talking about you're talking about perceived costs versus costs that people feel right in their pockets, and I think that's where that's where the argument hits a wall, and it becomes one of taxes and not one of the environment. There are plenty of ways to work on the environment, and the carbon tax is just not the only one.
It's interesting, though, that the PBO, Andrew, pointed out that he agreed. He said, this is just assuming that the carbon tax is the way to pursue it. No matter what they pursue, whether it's regulatory, whether it's subsidies, there ends up being a cost to Canadians. It's just whether it's upfront like a tax or whether it comes a different way.
Well, that's true. There's going to be some cost and some restructuring that's going to have to happen within the economy to deal with it. And there's going to be changes in terms of where the jobs are and what industries are impacted are going to differ. One of the challenges, I think, is that there's not been an honest study of what the impacts of those things are. And as long as this debate moves around about how high the price of gas needs to be or whether banning plastic straws somehow mitigates for buying a pipeline, I think that we're not really going to be in a very serious spot to decide what needs to happen to improve Canada's climate.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.